3 days before my wedding, his family slid a prenup across the table like it was already signed. They thought I was broke, powerless, and grateful. They didn't know I had $79 million, a lawyer, and a war chest of secrets buried so deep even my fiancé had never seen the bottom. His mother's smile was all teeth and venom as she pushed the pen toward me. I picked it up, feeling its weight like a blade. This isn't a love story. It's a dissection. My name is Sophia Marlowe, and I should have seen this coming. The Whitaker estate sprawled across 37 acres of manicured Colorado countryside, its stone facade catching the last amber light of a September evening. I'd driven up this circular driveway dozens of times over the past 18 months, but tonight felt different. The air held that brittle quality that comes before a storm, and even the ancient oaks seemed to lean away from the house. Daniel met me at the front door, his smile too bright, his kiss too quick. "You look beautiful," he said, but his eyes didn't hold mine. In the foyer's chandelier light, I could see the tension carved into his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit I'd grown to recognize as a warning sign. "Shh, your mother called another family dinner?" I asked, noting how he flinched at the word mother. "Something like that." He guided me toward the dining room, his hand hovering at my lower back without quite touching. "She's excited about the wedding preparations." The dining room was a monument to old-money Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars, oil paintings of dead Whitakers glowering from gilded frames, and a mahogany table that could seat 20, but tonight held only 3 place settings. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight like trapped stars, and the air smelled of expensive wine and something else. Something that reminded me of a funeral parlor. Evelyn Whitaker rose from her chair at the head of the table with the grace of a woman who'd spent decades perfecting the art of intimidation. At 62, she was still striking silver hair swept into a perfect chignon, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my first car. Her smile was warm, honey poured over razor blades. "Sophia, darling." She air-kissed my cheeks, her perfume a suffocating cloud of gardenias. "How lovely you look. That dress is charming." The pause before charming lasted exactly long enough to sting. I was wearing a navy sheath dress I'd bought at Nordstrom Nice, but not designer. Not Whitaker family nice. We settled into our chairs, and I noticed immediately that Daniel and his mother had positioned themselves across from me, like a tribunal. The candles flickered between us, casting dancing shadows that made their faces look theatrical, almost grotesque. Dinner passed in stilted conversation about flower arrangements and guest lists. Evelyn dominated, as always, her voice a melodic instrument of control. Daniel nodded and murmured agreement, occasionally glancing at me with what I now recognized as pity. It was during dessert, some elaborate French thing that tasted like disappointment, that Evelyn reached beside her chair and produced a leather portfolio. "Now, darling," she said, sliding the portfolio across the polished table toward me. "There's just one tiny matter we need to address before Saturday." The portfolio landed in front of me with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. My coffee cup rattled against its saucer as I set it down, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "What's this?" I asked, though something cold and knowing was already spreading through my chest. "Just a formality," Evelyn said, her voice silk over steel. "A prenuptial agreement, standard procedure for families like ours." I opened the portfolio with steady hands, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The document was thick, professionally bound, with Whitaker Family Legal emblazoned across the header. As I scanned the pages, each clause hit me like a physical blow. Financial penalty clauses for seeking therapy or counseling, complete waiver of inheritance rights, infidelity provisions that heavily favored Daniel, asset protection that would leave me with virtually nothing if the marriage ended, regardless of cause. But it was the signature page that made my blood turn to ice water. Daniel's name was already there, his familiar scrawl dark against the cream paper. He'd signed this before tonight, before this dinner, before giving me the chance to even see it. I looked up to find them both watching me with the intensity of predators studying wounded prey. Evelyn's smile never wavered. Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. "This is quite comprehensive," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Our lawyers are very thorough," Evelyn replied. "We believe in protecting what we've built. I'm sure you understand." The "we" hit me like a slap. Not Daniel and me, them, the Whitakers, the family I'd foolishly thought I was about to join. "Of course," I said, closing the portfolio. "I'll need to review this with my attorney." Evelyn's laugh tinkled like broken crystal. "Oh, darling, surely that's not necessary. It's really quite standard. And the wedding is in 3 days." The timeline wasn't accidental. They'd waited until the last possible moment, when the deposits were paid, the guests invited, the dress altered, when walking away would cost me not just love, but public humiliation. "I always review legal documents," I said, standing and tucking the portfolio under my arm. "I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of due diligence." For just a moment, Evelyn's mask slipped, and I saw something sharp and ugly underneath. Then the smile returned, bright as poison. "Of course, dear. How prudent of you." I kissed Daniel goodbye. His lips felt like paper against mine and walked out into the Colorado night. My heels clicked against the stone steps in a steady rhythm that sounded like a countdown. In my car, I sat in the darkness for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a phone they'd never seen a burner I'd carried for months, hoping I'd never need it. Claire Donovan answered on the second ring. "They made their move," I said without preamble. "Right on schedule," she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Are you ready for yours?" I looked back at the Whitaker mansion, its windows glowing like the eyes of some sleeping beast. Soon, those lights would go out one by one. Soon, everything would change. "I've been ready for months," I said, and started the engine. Back in my Denver penthouse at 11:30 p.m., I spread the prenuptial agreement across my granite kitchen island like a surgeon preparing for an autopsy. Each page under the halogen lights revealed new horrors, clauses so draconian they bordered on sadistic. Section 4.2. Party B agrees that seeking psychological counseling, therapy, or psychiatric treatment during the marriage shall constitute grounds for immediate forfeiture of spousal support, with additional financial penalties of $50,000 per occurrence. I laughed a sound like breaking glass in the silence of my apartment. They thought mental health support was weakness, something to be punished. How very Whitaker of them. Section 7.1. In the event of infidelity by Party A, Party B waives all rights to marital assets. In the event of infidelity by Party B, Party A retains full discretionary authority over asset distribution. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Daniel could cheat with impunity, but if I so much as looked at another man wrong, I'd be left with nothing. Not that it mattered, they had no idea what nothing actually meant to someone worth $79 million. But it was Section 12 that truly revealed their hand. Party B acknowledges she brings no substantial assets to the marriage and waives all claims to property acquired before or during the union. No substantial assets. I set down my wine glass with careful precision, feeling something dark and surgical settle in my chest. They'd investigated me, of course, but their investigators had found exactly what I'd wanted them to find: a successful but modest financial advisor from Denver, living in a nice but not extravagant apartment, driving a 3-year-old BMW, wearing clothes from department stores rather than boutiques. They'd never dug deep enough to find the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the carefully hidden portfolio that had grown from my father's modest life insurance policy into something that could buy and sell the Whitaker estate 3 times over. I walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Denver skyline. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably lying awake, wrestling with whatever was left of his conscience. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The truth was, I'd loved him once. Really loved him. When we'd met at that charity gala 18 months ago, he'd seemed different from the entitled trust fund babies I usually encountered. Quieter, thoughtful. He'd asked me about books instead of my job, had listened when I talked about my childhood in small-town Colorado, had seemed genuinely interested in the woman behind the business suit. For 6 months, I'd believed it was real. He'd come to my apartment with takeout and terrible movies, had held me when I cried about my mother's anniversary, had made me think that maybe, just maybe, I could have both love and security. But then the introductions to family friends had started, the subtle corrections when I mentioned my background, the way he'd begun editing my stories, polishing away the rough edges of my past until I barely recognized myself in his retelling. "She's very ambitious," he'd say with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "A real self-made woman." As if ambition was something to be apologized for. As if making myself into something more than I was born to be was a character flaw rather than an achievement. I'd started watching more carefully after that. The way he deferred to his mother on every decision. The way he'd changed the subject when I talked about my work. The way he'd grown increasingly uncomfortable when I displayed any knowledge of finance or investments that exceeded what a simple financial advisor should possess. He wanted a wife who was successful enough not to embarrass him, but not so successful as to threaten him. Someone grateful, someone manageable, someone who would smile and nod and look pretty at charity galas while never questioning why her opinions didn't matter in the boardroom of their marriage. Daniel's signature on the prenup proved what I'd suspected for months. I wasn't marrying the man I'd fallen in love with. I was marrying a projection, a carefully crafted image designed to lure me into exactly this trap. The phone buzzed against the granite. "Claire again." "I've reviewed the documents you sent," she said without preamble. "They're worse than we anticipated." "How so?" "The psychological evaluation requirement. That's not standard language. Someone added that specifically. And the financial penalty clauses. Sophia, this reads like something designed to break you psychologically, not just financially." I felt something cold settle deeper in my chest. "Evelyn." "Has to be. Daniel doesn't have the imagination for this level of cruelty. She's trying to ensure you'll never have the resources or support to fight back if things go wrong." I walked to my safe, hidden behind a reproduction Monet that most people assumed was just expensive-looking decoration. Inside, next to the documents they'd never find, was a manila folder I'd hoped never to open. "Claire, remember what we discussed about contingencies?" "Which ones?" But I could hear the anticipation in her voice. "All of them." There was a pause. Then, "Are you sure once we start down that path?" They started down that path the moment they decided I was prey instead of family. "I'm just going to finish it." I hung up and poured myself another glass of wine, thinking about Daniel's face across the dinner table tonight. The guilt, the shame, the way he'd looked at me like I was already gone. Maybe that was the most honest thing about this entire situation. In their minds, the woman they thought they knew, small-town Sophia with her modest ambitions and grateful heart, she was already gone. They just didn't realize they'd killed her tonight, and what was walking around in her skin was something infinitely more dangerous. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of September day that made Colorado famous. I'd barely slept, but adrenaline had sharpened my focus to a razor's edge. At 7:15 a.m., I was already dressed and ready for what I'd privately begun calling reconnaissance. The Whitaker family had their routines, and I'd spent 18 months learning them. Evelyn's Thursday morning coffee circle at the Cherry Hills Country Club, her habit of speaking just a little too loudly when she wanted to be overheard, her assumption that everyone around her was either an ally or irrelevant. I arrived at the club at 9:30, taking a corner table in the cafe with a clear view of Evelyn's usual spot. The recording device disguised as a simple silver pen sat innocuously beside my coffee cup. Claire had provided it months ago, along with the reminder that Colorado was a one-party consent state, As long as I was present, anything I recorded would be admissible. Evelyn swept in at 9:45, resplendent in cream cashmere and pearls, trailed by her usual coterie of society wives: Margaret Blackwood, whose husband owned half of downtown Denver; Patricia Ashworth, old money so ancient it had moss growing on it; Victoria Drummond, whose divorce settlement had made headlines 5 years ago. They settled at their reserved table like birds of prey, choosing a perch. "Well, ladies," Evelyn began, her voice carrying exactly as I'd expected, "you'll never guess what little drama unfolded last night." I kept my eyes on my tablet, playing the part of a busy professional catching up on emails. Just another anonymous woman in business attire, invisible to their notice. "Do tell," Margaret said, leaning forward with the hunger of someone who lived for gossip. "Our dear Daniel's fiancé," Evelyn said, pronouncing the word like it tasted bitter, "had quite the reaction to our prenuptial agreement. You'd have thought we'd asked her to sign away her firstborn." Laughter rippled around the table, sharp and knowing. "Why, what did you expect?" Patricia asked. Small-town ambition in a designer dress. Of course she'd balk at protecting the family assets. Small-town ambition in a designer dress. I memorized the phrase, feeling it settle into the growing file of evidence in my mind. "The amusing part," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping just enough to draw her audience closer, "is how seriously she took it all, demanding to review it with her attorney, as if she has real legal counsel rather than some strip mall lawyer in Denver." Victoria made a sympathetic clicking sound. "They always cling to the latter, don't they? Even when it's obviously beyond their reach." "They always cling to the latter," another phrase for my collection. "The wedding is in 2 days," Margaret observed. "Surely she'll cave. The deposits are paid. The guests are coming. Walking away now would be social suicide." "Oh, she'll sign," Evelyn said with the confidence of a woman who'd never been told no. "Daniel's already explained the situation to her. Women like Sophia understand leverage, even if they don't like it. She'll take her medicine like a good girl and be grateful for the privilege." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the conversation wash over me like acid rain. Each word, each laugh, each casual dismissal of my intelligence and agency was being preserved in digital amber. "Besides," Evelyn added, her voice taking on a particularly venomous quality, "I had Dr. Hartwell prepare a psychological evaluation. Nothing official, of course, but it raises some interesting questions about her emotional stability. Insurance, you might say." The pen in my hand nearly snapped. "Dr. Hartwell, a family friend of the Whitakers, not a licensed psychiatrist. Any evaluation he'd prepared would be worth less than the paper it was printed on. But that wasn't the point. The point was creating a narrative, a foundation for future legal maneuvering if I ever tried to challenge them." "How deliciously thorough," Patricia murmured. "Though I do hope you're not being too harsh on the poor dear. Some of these climbers can be quite fragile when their fantasies collapse." "Fragile," Evelyn repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose that's accurate. There's something brittle about women who think they can reinvent themselves. They never quite shake that underlying insecurity. Do they?" I felt something crystalline and cold forming in my chest. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was breakable. They thought silence meant surrender. At 10:20, they moved on to other topics: charity galas, vacation homes, whose daughter had gotten into which Ivy League school. I finished my coffee and left, the recording device warm in my palm like a captured secret. In my car, I called Claire. "I have them," I said without preamble. "All of it." "Enough." Evelyn admitting to fabricating psychological evaluations. The whole circle discussing me like I'm a gold digger who doesn't know her place. It's everything we need to prove coercion and fraudulent inducement. "Perfect. How are you feeling?" I sat in the country club parking lot, watching Evelyn's Range Rover gleam in the morning sun. How was I feeling? Like a surgeon who just made the first incision? Like a chess player who just sacrificed a pawn to capture a queen? "Focused," I said finally. They think silence equals surrender, but for me, silence is strategy. And Daniel? I thought about my fiancé, probably at his office right now, probably telling himself he was protecting me by going along with his mother's schemes, probably believing that love meant making the hard choices for people too naive to make them themselves. Daniel made his choice when he signed that prenup without telling me. Now he gets to live with the consequences. I hung up and started the engine, thinking about tomorrow's family dinner. Evelyn would be expecting contrition, maybe tears. She'd be expecting me to fold like the small-town girl she thought I was. Instead, she was going to get a masterclass in what real power looked like when it finally decided to show its teeth. Friday evening arrived with the weight of an execution. The Whitaker family dinner, their final attempt to secure my compliance before tomorrow's wedding. I dressed with surgical precision, a black Armani sheath that whispered rather than shouted wealth, pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and my mother's simple gold wedding band on my right hand. The ring was my talisman. When I was 8 and she was dying, my mother had pressed it into my palm and whispered, "Never let them make you small, baby girl. You fold paper flowers when the world tries to crush you. You make something beautiful from what they think is worthless." Tonight, I would fold the most beautiful flower of my life. I arrived at the Whitaker estate at 7:30 sharp, the gravel crunching under my tires like broken bones. Daniel met me at the door, and I could see the guilt eating him alive from the inside. His kiss landed somewhere near my cheek, a butterfly touch that felt like an apology. "You look stunning," he said, but his eyes were the color of storm clouds. "Thank you." I smoothed my dress with hands that didn't tremble. "Shall we?" The dining room had been transformed into a stage set for intimidation. The lights were dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that made the oil paintings of dead Whitakers look like they were leaning in to witness my humiliation. The table was set for 4, Daniel, Evelyn, myself, and Daniel's father Richard, who usually avoided these performances but had been summoned for the finale. Evelyn rose as I entered, resplendent in burgundy silk that matched her lipstick. Her smile was all teeth and satisfaction. "Sophia, darling, I trust you've had time to consider our little document." "I have," I said, taking my designated seat. The chair felt like a defendant's dock. Richard Whitaker nodded at me with the distant politeness of a man who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of emotional absence. At 70, he was still handsome in the way that money preserved, but his eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd long ago surrendered his will to his wife. Dinner began with the ritualistic precision of a funeral mass. Soup course, polite inquiries about my work, carefully orchestrated compliments about the wedding arrangements, all of it foreplay before the main event. It was during the fish course that Evelyn finally drew her blade. "Now then," she said, setting down her fork with delicate precision. "I'm sure we're all eager to put this prenuptial business behind us. Such an unpleasant necessity, but Daniel's future must be protected." She spoke as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away, as if my future was somehow separate from Daniel's, inconsequential, disposable. "Of course," I said, reaching for my water glass. The crystal felt cool and solid against my palm. "Protecting the future is important." "I'm so glad you understand." Evelyn's smile could have cut glass. "Daniel was worried you might be difficult about the terms, but I told him that women of quality always recognize wisdom when they see it." Women of quality. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. "Mother," Daniel said quietly, the first word he'd spoken since we'd sat down. "What, darling?" Evelyn turned to him with practiced surprise. "Surely you don't object to me complimenting your bride to be—" I watched this exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal rituals. Daniel's face was flushed with shame, but he said nothing. Richard continued eating as if the conversation weren't happening at all. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "I found the document quite illuminating." Evelyn's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Oh, I reached into my purse and withdrew a simple white napkin from my apartment. With movements I'd practiced 100 times as a child, I began to fold, crease, turn, fold again, my mother's hands guiding mine across 26 years of memory. It revealed so much about family values, I continued, my fingers working the paper with surgical precision. The importance of trust, the value of transparency, the beauty of partnership built on mutual respect. Daniel was staring at my hands now, mesmerized by the emerging shape. Richard had finally looked up from his plate. Even Evelyn seemed caught off guard by the strange intimacy of the gesture. "I particularly appreciate it," I said, executing a complex fold that would have made my mother proud. The section about psychological evaluations. Such a thoughtful touch. Evelyn's mask slipped for just a moment. "I'm sorry." The requirement for mental health assessments. Though I was curious about Dr. Hartwell's credentials, I had my attorney look into his background. I completed another fold, the paper flower beginning to take shape in my hands. Fascinating what one discovers with proper research. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down. "What are you implying?" Evelyn's voice had lost its honey coating. I finished the final fold and set the completed paper flower beside my wine glass, a perfect white rose, delicate and beautiful and made from something they'd dismissed as worthless. "I'm not implying anything," I said, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. "I'm stating facts. Dr. Hartwell hasn't held a valid license to practice psychology in Colorado for 3 years. Any evaluation he provided would be worthless in court, fraudulent, even." The silence that followed was the kind that comes before avalanches. "Sophia," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you saying?" I turned to him with something that might have been pity. "I'm saying that people who play games should be very certain they understand the rules, and the penalties for cheating." Evelyn's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. "You're being ridiculous. The evaluation was merely a fabrication," I finished, "created to provide leverage in case I ever challenged the prenuptial agreement, rather like having a loaded gun in case the victim gets difficult." Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should—" "No," I said, standing with fluid grace. "I think we should finish this conversation. After all, transparency is so important in family relationships." I picked up the paper flower and placed it gently in front of Evelyn. "My mother taught me to make these when I was small. She said they were proof that you could create something beautiful from what others threw away." Evelyn stared at the flower as if it were a poisonous snake. "Tomorrow," I continued, "I will sign your prenuptial agreement, but you should know that I've made a few small additions. Nothing dramatic, just some clauses about fraud, coercion, and the consequences of underestimating one's opposition." Daniel's face had gone ashen. "Sophia, please." "Please what?" I asked, and for the first time all evening, my voice carried the full weight of my fury. "Please pretend that I don't know what you really think of me. Please ignore the fact that you signed a document designed to destroy me without even discussing it. Please continue playing the grateful little climber who's lucky to be allowed at your table." The paper flower sat in the center of the table like a declaration of war, white and perfect and unbreakable. "I will see you all tomorrow," I said, gathering my purse. "It should be a very illuminating day." I walked out of that dining room with my head high and my spine straight, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. In my car, my hands finally began to shake, not from fear, but from the pure adrenaline of a predator who had just shown her teeth to prey that thought it was the hunter. Tomorrow, they would learn what it meant to underestimate a woman who had 79 million reasons to never be anyone's victim. Saturday morning broke gray and cold, the kind of Colorado weather that promised snow before nightfall. Wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in the guest house behind the Whitaker estate at 6A. Surrounded by documents that would either liberate me or destroy everything I'd built. Claire had arrived at 5:30 with 2 additional lawyers and a forensic accountant. The guest house's main room had been transformed into a war room, laptops humming, printers churning out revised contracts, and coffee growing cold in forgotten cups. "The counter-contract is ready," Claire said, sliding the bound document across the mahogany table. "Every clause they inserted. We've matched with something sharper. The voiding provision you requested is buried in subsection 14C. Unless they read every word with microscopic attention, they'll miss it entirely." I picked up the document, noting its weight, heavier than Evelyn's original, dense with legal language that would take hours to parse completely. And if coercion or fraud is proven, the entire agreement becomes null and void, not just unenforceable, completely invalid, as if it never existed. Claire's smile was sharp as a blade. Plus punitive damages for emotional distress and fraudulent inducement. "How much?" "7 figures, minimum." I felt something cold and satisfied settle in my chest. Perfect. The forensic accountant, a severe woman named Rebecca Walsh, looked up from her laptop. "I've also prepared the financial disclosure addendum you requested. It lists your actual net worth, all $79.3 million, along with documentation proving you've had these assets for over 5 years. They'll demand to know why I hid it." "And you'll tell them the truth," Claire said. "You wanted to be loved for yourself, not your money. It's romantic, really, tragic, even. Makes their behavior look even more predatory." Through the guest house windows, I could see the main estate beginning to stir. Catering trucks arriving, florists carrying in arrangements, the machinery of a Whitaker wedding grinding into motion, expensive and elaborate and hollow. At 7:15, my phone buzzed. "Daniel." "We need to talk," his text read, "before the signing." I showed the message to Claire. She frowned. "Could be an attempt to manipulate you privately. Record everything." I activated the voice memo app and walked out into the Colorado morning. Daniel was waiting by the garden fountain, still in pajamas and a robe, his hair uncombed and his face haggard. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Sophia," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "about last night." Which part?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "The part where your mother compared me to something she'd scrape off her shoe, or the part where you sat there and let her—" He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Mother has expectations, standards. She's trying to protect the family. From me. From anyone who might—" He stopped, realizing the trap he'd walked into. "Who might what? Daniel. Take advantage, gold dig, climb above my station." I moved closer, noting how he stepped back. "Is that really what you think of me?" "No, of course not. But Mother sees things differently. She's had to deal with fortune hunters before, and she assumed I was one without bothering to actually know me." I felt my voice growing harder. "Tell me, Daniel, what do you actually know about my finances?" His confusion was almost comical. "You're a financial advisor. You do well for yourself. You have that nice apartment in Denver, the BMW. Do you know what I'm worth?" What do you mean?" The moment stretched between us like a taut wire. Here it was the chance to salvage something, to pull back from the precipice. All I had to do was explain, show him the truth, appeal to whatever love might still exist between us. Instead, I found myself studying his face with clinical detachment, the weak chin he hid behind a carefully maintained beard, the way his eyes shifted when he was uncomfortable, the soft hands that had never earned a callus or missed a meal. "Nothing," I said finally. "I mean nothing." Relief flooded his features. "Sophia, I know last night was difficult, but after we're married, things will be different. Mother will come around once she sees that I know my place, that I'll be properly grateful for the privilege of bearing the Whitaker name." "You're being dramatic." The word hit me like ice water. Dramatic. As if my anger was unreasonable. As if my feelings were hysterical female nonsense to be dismissed and managed. "Perhaps I am," I said quietly. Perhaps I should be more grateful. After all, it's not every day a small-town climber gets the chance to marry into such a distinguished family. Daniel's face brightened, missing the razor edge in my voice entirely. Exactly. And the prenup. It's just a formality. It doesn't mean anything really changes between us. I stared at him for a long moment, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the charming man I'd fallen in love with, but the weak boy who'd never learned to stand up for anything that mattered, who thought love meant accepting scraps and calling them a feast. You're right, I said. Nothing changes. So you'll sign it, the original document. Oh, Daniel, I smiled, and something in my expression made him take another step back. I'll sign a prenuptial agreement today, but not the one your mother gave me. What do you mean? I mean, I've had my own lawyers review the situation. They've prepared some modifications. Nothing too dramatic. Just a few clauses about honesty, transparency, and the consequences of fraud. His face went pale. Fraud, Sophia, you're scaring me. Good, I said, turning to walk back to the guest house. You should be scared. You should all be scared, because today, you're going to learn what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Sophia, wait. I paused at the guest house door. Oh, and Daniel. You might want to call your mother. Tell her the signing has been moved up to 9A. Ma'am, I have a wedding to get ready for, and I'd hate for legal matters to make me late for my own ceremony. I left him standing by the fountain, looking lost and confused and small. Through the guest house windows, I could see Claire and her team putting the finishing touches on our counteroffensive. At 8:45, Evelyn Whitaker would walk into this room expecting to witness my surrender. Instead, she was going to discover that the small-town girl she'd so thoroughly underestimated had just become the most dangerous person in her world. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and checked my watch. Less than an hour now until the real wedding began, not the ceremony in the garden, but the execution in this room. And I was ready, at 8:45 a.m. The guest house door opened with the authority of someone who owned the world. Evelyn Whitaker swept in wearing dove-gray silk and a smile that could have frozen hell, followed by Daniel in a man I didn't recognize late 50s, expensive suit, the predatory stillness of a career lawyer. Sophia, darling, Evelyn said, her gaze taking in the legal team arranged around the mahogany table. How thorough of you. I see you've brought friends. Just my advisors, I said, rising from my chair with fluid grace. I'm sure you understand the importance of proper representation. The unknown man stepped forward. Robert Ashford, Whitaker Family Counsel. I trust we can conclude this matter expeditiously. The ceremony begins at 11:30. Claire stood, extending her hand with the smile of a shark scenting blood. Claire Donovan, representing Ms. Marlowe. And yes, we're all eager to finalize the arrangements. The room arranged itself into opposing camps, Evelyn, Daniel, and their lawyer on one side of the table, my team on the other. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the dust motes dancing between us like tiny witnesses to what was about to unfold. Now then, Evelyn said, settling into her chair with queenly authority. Let's sign this little document and move on to more pleasant matters. Daniel tells me you've prepared some sort of addendum. Several, actually, I said, sliding the bound contract across the polished wood. Nothing dramatic, just some clarifications to ensure we're all operating with complete transparency. Ashford picked up the document, his expression shifting as he noted its thickness. This is considerably more extensive than the original agreement. Legal documents should be thorough, Claire said pleasantly. I'm sure you'll appreciate the attention to detail. As Ashford began reading, I watched Evelyn's face carefully, confidence gradually giving way to irritation as the minutes ticked by. Daniel fidgeted in his chair, shooting anxious glances between his mother and the contract that was taking far longer to review than expected. Section 14, Ashford murmured, his frown deepening. This voiding clause is quite unusual. Standard protection against coercion and fraud, Claire replied smoothly. I'm surprised it wasn't included in your original document. Evelyn's head snapped up. Coercion! That's ridiculous. No one has coerced anyone. Of course not, I said, my voice honey over razors. Though I suppose that would depend on how one defines coercion. Presenting a prenuptial agreement 3 days before a wedding, for instance. Or fabricating psychological evaluations to create leverage. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the main house. I have no idea what you're talking about, Evelyn said, but her voice had lost its musical quality. I reached into my purse and withdrew a small digital recorder, setting it gently on the table. Yesterday morning, Cherry Hills Country Club, 9:45 a.m. to 10:20 a.m. Would you like me to play the relevant sections? Daniel's face went white. Sophia, what is this? This, I said, pressing play, is your mother explaining to her friends how she had Dr. Hartwell prepare a psychological evaluation. Quote, nothing official, of course, but it raises some interesting questions about her emotional stability. Insurance, you might say. Evelyn's own voice filled the room, cultured and venomous, discussing me like a problem to be managed. The color drained from her face as the recording continued, each word a nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed defense. You recorded us, she whispered. Colorado is a one-party consent state, Claire said helpfully. Perfectly legal as long as one party to the conversation knows about the recording. Mrs. Whitaker, Rebecca Walsh spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional. Could you explain what you meant by insurance in this context? That was taken out of context. The context, I interrupted, was creating fraudulent documentation to support a coercive prenuptial agreement. Dr. Hartwell, as I'm sure you know, hasn't held a valid license to practice psychology in Colorado for 3 years. Ashford set down the contract with careful precision. Mrs. Whitaker, did you ask Dr. Hartwell to prepare any sort of psychological assessment of Ms. Marlowe? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Evelyn looked at Daniel, at her lawyer, at everyone except me. It was just, we needed to understand. She seemed unstable. Or based on what clinical evidence, Rebecca pressed. What training or qualifications gave you the authority to make that determination? She was being difficult about the prenup. So you fabricated medical documentation to strengthen your negotiating position, Claire said. That's fraud. Mrs. Whitaker. Criminal fraud. Daniel finally found his voice. Mother, you didn't tell me about any psychological evaluation. Evelyn turned to her son with desperation creeping into her eyes. Darling, you know I was only trying to protect you. She was asking too many questions, demanding too much. I was demanding basic respect, I said quietly. The same consideration you'd show any human being worthy of dignity. You're being melodramatic. Am I? I stood, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where our wedding was supposed to take place in less than 3 hours. Let me share something with all of you, something that might clarify the situation. I turned back to the room, noting how they all leaned forward slightly, drawn by the gravity in my voice. Daniel, you asked me yesterday what I'm worth. You assumed I was being metaphorical. I wasn't. I picked up Rebecca's financial disclosure from the table. My current net worth is $79.3 million. Assets acquired through careful investment of my father's life insurance policy, accumulated over 15 years of strategic financial planning. The document hit the table with a soft thud that sounded like a death knell. Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Evelyn stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Only Ashford seemed to maintain any composure, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the disclosure. That's impossible, Evelyn stammered. You live in a modest apartment. You drive a 3-year-old car. You buy your clothes at department stores. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I owned. I said simply, Foolish of me, perhaps, but I believed in the romance of it. A woman of modest means winning the heart of a good man through her character rather than her bank account. I moved closer to the table, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But you never saw my character, did you? Evelyn, you saw small-town ambition in a designer dress, a climber who needed to be managed, a threat to be neutralized with legal documents and fabricated psychological evaluations. Sophia, Daniel said weakly, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, I replied, and my voice carried no warmth at all. Because you never asked. You were too busy protecting yourself from the gold digger you assumed I was to notice that you were the one bringing nothing of value to this relationship. The words hit him like physical blows. I felt something that might have been pity, but it was distant, clinical, like watching surgery through glass. So, I said, settling back into my chair, shall we continue with the contract? I believe we were discussing the consequences of fraud and coercion. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ashford cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his expertise. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should take a brief recess to discuss— No, I said, my voice cutting through his diplomatic retreat like a scalpel. We finish this now. I have a wedding dress to put on. I reached across the table and picked up a pen, not the Mont Blanc that Evelyn had probably expected me to use, but a simple black Bic that had cost 99 cents. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I'll sign your prenuptial agreement, I continued, positioning the pen over the signature line of my revised contract. But first, let's be absolutely clear about what we're signing. Claire leaned forward, her voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. This document contains a comprehensive voiding clause triggered by any evidence of coercion, fraud, or misrepresentation. The recorded conversation we just heard, combined with the fabricated psychological evaluation, constitutes clear grounds for immediate nullification. Furthermore, Rebecca added, consulting her notes, the financial disclosure reveals that Ms. Marlowe's assets exceed the combined Whitaker family holdings by approximately 30%. This fundamentally alters the premise upon which the original agreement was drafted. Evelyn's face had gone the color of ash. This is extortion. No, I said quietly, signing my name with deliberate strokes. This is justice. Extortion would be if I demanded money to keep quiet about your fraud. Instead, I'm simply ensuring that the truth has consequences. Daniel found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sophia, please, we can work this out. Start over. Forget the prenup entirely. Forget. I set down the pen and looked at him with something approaching wonder. Daniel, do you understand what just happened here? Your mother fabricated medical documents. She committed fraud. She gathered her friends to mock me as a gold digger while plotting to control me with psychological manipulation. I stood, smoothing my skirt with hands that remained perfectly steady. And you sat there, through every dinner, every subtle insult, every casual dismissal of my intelligence and worth. You sat there and let it happen because it was easier than standing up to her. I was trying to protect you. From what? The question cracked like a whip. From your mother's disapproval, from having to choose between your family and your fiancé, from having to grow a spine and act like a man instead of a perpetual child. Daniel flinched as if I'd struck him. Beside him, Evelyn was staring at the signed contract as if it were a death warrant. Mrs. Whitaker, Claire said, sliding a copy of the voiding petition across the table. This document formally challenges the original prenuptial agreement on grounds of fraud and coercion. You have 48 hours to respond through legal counsel. Evelyn picked up the papers with shaking hands. You can't prove anything. The recording it's taken out of context. Actually, a new voice said from the doorway, I think we can prove quite a lot. All heads turned as Marina Cole stepped into the room. Tall, elegant, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any conversation. She carried a leather briefcase and the unmistakable confidence of an expert witness. "Dr. Marina Cole," she said, introducing herself to the room. "Licensed psychiatrist, forensic specialist, and Sophia's oldest friend. I believe you have some questions about psychological evaluations." Evelyn's remaining color drained away entirely. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marina opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "Dr. Marcus Hartwell, license revoked 3 years ago for falsifying patient records. Currently under investigation by the Colorado Medical Board for additional infractions." She placed a document on the table. "This is his supposed evaluation of Ms. Marlowe. Would you like me to detail the numerous professional violations it contains?" "That's not necessary," Ashford said quickly, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in. "My client has no comment on any alleged evaluation." Your client," Marina said with surgical precision, "solicited fraudulent medical documentation from an unlicensed practitioner for the purpose of coercing a prenuptial agreement. In Colorado, that's a felony." The word felony hung in the air like a death sentence. "Furthermore," Marina continued, "I've prepared my own assessment of Ms. Marlowe's psychological state." She placed another document on the table. "Clean bill of mental health. No signs of the instability your alleged evaluation claims to have found," which raises interesting questions about Dr. Hartwell's methods, doesn't it? Evelyn's hands were trembling now. "This is all speculation. You can't prove I asked him for anything." I reached for my phone and selected another audio file. "Thursday morning, 9:15 a.m. Your phone call to Dr. Hartwell. Would you like me to play it?" The recording device had been in my purse during that call, picking up both sides of the conversation with crystal clarity. Evelyn's voice filled the room again, this time instructing Hartwell to prepare something that raises questions about her stability and promising to make it worth his while. "That's enough," Daniel said suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mother, how could you do this?" Evelyn turned to her son with desperate eyes. "I was protecting you. She was going to take everything." "She already had everything." Daniel's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "Don't you understand? She has more money than our entire family. She could have bought our house, our cars, our whole lifestyle, and still had money left over, and she never said a word because she wanted me to love her for who she was, not what she owned." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Daniel looked at me with something that might have been understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "You really did love me," he said quietly. "I did," I replied, and for the first time that morning, my voice carried a note of genuine sadness. "Past tense, Daniel. I loved who I thought you were. The man who would have stood up for me. The man who would have told his mother that the woman he planned to marry deserved respect." I gathered my purse and the signed contracts, feeling the weight of finality settling around us like dust. "The prenuptial agreement is voided," I said to the room. "The fraud charges stand, and the wedding—" I paused, looking at Daniel one last time. "The wedding is off." "Sophia, please!" Daniel started to rise from his chair. "Sit down," I said, and something in my voice made him collapse back into his seat. "You thought you were caging me. Instead, you just locked yourself in." I walked toward the door, then paused without turning around. "Oh, and Evelyn, you might want to call your guests. Tell them there's been a change of plans. I'm sure they'll understand." The last thing I heard as I stepped out into the Colorado morning was the sound of Evelyn Whitaker finally beginning to cry. At 11:30 a.m., the Whitaker garden should have been filled with 300 guests witnessing the union of two souls. Instead, it was empty except for the caterers quietly dismantling the elaborate arrangements and the florists collecting their thousands of dollars worth of white roses. I stood at my bedroom window in the guest house, still in my robe, watching the careful choreography of a wedding's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me that the flower symbols of beauty created from what others might dismiss as worthless were being thrown away while the real value of the day lay in what had been revealed rather than what had been destroyed. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since 10 a.m. Text messages from concerned friends who'd received last-minute cancellation calls, voicemails from confused vendors wondering about payments and pickup times, 3 missed calls from my mother's sister in Nebraska, who'd driven 12 hours to watch me marry into Colorado royalty. But it was the silence from the main house that spoke loudest of all. Through the guest house walls, I could hear Claire and her team packing up their legal arsenal. The contracts were signed, the evidence cataloged, the case files organized with military precision. In 48 hours, the Colorado Attorney General's office would receive a formal complaint alleging fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. The Whitaker family name, polished by generations of careful cultivation, would be dragged through courtrooms and newspaper headlines. Marina knocked softly on my bedroom door. "How are you holding up?" I turned from the window, noting how the midday light caught the silver threads in my hair that hadn't been there 18 months ago. "I'm free," I said simply. For the first time in over a year. I'm completely free. No regrets. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the 1.5 years spent believing in love? The nights I'd lain awake planning a future that was built on quicksand. The moments when I genuinely believed Daniel was the man who would stand beside me through whatever storms life might bring. "I regret the time wasted," I said finally, "but not the lesson learned. I'd rather discover someone's true character before marriage than after." Marina settled into the armchair by the window, her psychiatrist's training evident in the way she read the emotional landscape of the room. "What will you do now?" "Now," I laughed, and for the first time in days, it was a sound of genuine amusement rather than bitter irony. "Now, I'm going to live my life without asking permission from anyone. I'm going to use my money to build something meaningful instead of hiding it to protect someone else's ego. I'm going to find someone who sees my success as an asset rather than a threat. And if the Whitakers try to retaliate, let them." I walked to my closet and pulled out a simple black dress designer, but understated. The kind of outfit that whispered rather than shouted. "I have $79 million, the best legal team money can buy, and evidence of their fraud recorded in their own voices. What exactly are they going to do to me?" At 12:45 p.m., I walked out of the guest house for the last time. My bags were already in the car I'd never unpacked completely, some survival instinct keeping me ready for exactly this moment. The Colorado mountains stretched endlessly in the distance, their peaks crowned with early snow that caught the autumn sun like scattered diamonds. The main house loomed behind me, its windows dark and silent. I didn't look back. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Daniel standing at his bedroom window, watching me leave. His face was a map of regret and confusion, the expression of a man finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost. I felt something that might have been pity, but it was distant and clean, like looking at a photograph of a stranger's tragedy. By 1:30 p.m., I was back in Denver, pulling into the parking garage of my building, the same building Daniel had once described as charming for what it is. Not knowing that I owned the entire structure along with 3 others like it, the same life I'd been embarrassed to show his family was actually a carefully constructed facade designed to hide wealth that could have bought their estate 3 times over. My penthouse felt different now, not like a hiding place, but like a launching pad. I poured myself a glass of wine and called Claire. "It's done," she said without preamble. "The complaint will be filed Monday morning. The media response should be illuminating." "Good," I said, surprising myself with how little satisfaction I felt. This had never been about revenge. I realized it had been about truth, about consequences, about ensuring that people who treated others as disposable understood that actions had prices. "What about Daniel?" Claire asked. "He wasn't directly involved in the fraud." I thought about my former fiancé, probably sitting in his childhood bedroom, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. Daniel's punishment is having to live with the knowledge that he had something real and chose to protect his mother's prejudices instead of his fiancée's dignity. That's a sentence that will last longer than any court could impose. As the sun set over the Denver skyline, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about paper flowers, about my mother's hands guiding mine, teaching me that beauty could be created from what others discarded as worthless. The Whitakers had tried to make me small, to crush me into a shape that fit their narrow definition of acceptable. Instead, they'd taught me something invaluable, that the people who truly deserve your love are those who see your strength and celebrate it, not those who see it and try to diminish it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I thought it might be Daniel, but the message was from a reporter at the Denver Post. Ms. Marlowe, we're following a story about alleged fraud in a high-profile prenuptial agreement. Would you care to comment? I smiled and set the phone down without responding. The story would tell itself soon enough. Tomorrow, the Whitaker name would be associated with words like fraud and coercion instead of philanthropy and prestige. Their social circle would dissect every detail with the same vicious enthusiasm Evelyn had shown when discussing my supposed inadequacies. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had learned the difference between being loved and being tolerated, who had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can create from a situation designed to destroy you is your own freedom. I raised my wine glass to the Colorado sunset and toasted the paper flower I'd left on their dinner table, white and perfect and unbreakable, a symbol of what happens when you underestimate someone who knows how to transform pressure into power. The small-town girl they'd tried to cage was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who would never again mistake kindness for weakness, or love for the privilege of being accepted. And that woman had 79 million reasons to make sure this lesson was never forgotten. Sir, thank you for listening to this story of revenge, resilience, and the power of knowing your own worth. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story right now? Are you at home, on your commute, or perhaps somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts and location so we can connect with fellow listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the complex dynamics of power, love, and justice. What did you think of Sophia's choice? Share your thoughts and let's discuss.